The summer evening on the roof of my house was something special. The wind barely touched the candles, making their flames tremble but not extinguish. The table, set for two, stood under an old wooden canopy decorated with a string of tiny light bulbs. On the light linen napkins, perfectly rolled cutlery lay. Everything, from the dessert to the small bouquet of lavender in the center of the table, was thoughtfully arranged down to the smallest detail. Tonight, I wanted to create a dinner that Mark would remember for a long time. No phones, no rush, nothing to distract us from each other. I placed the last glass, checked if the candles were burning, and sat on the edge of the chair, feeling a slight excitement. I had a feeling that this evening would be special. When the doorbell rang, I barely held back a smile. He always came a little early, as if he couldn't wait. Rising to the door, I pressed the button and said my usual, "Is that you, Mark?" In response, I heard a faint, barely recognizable voice. "It's Sarah. May I come up?" Sarah? I wasn't expecting her. Not that I was against her visit. She was my neighbor, a childhood friend, someone with whom I shared the warmest memories. But her voice sounded strange, hollow, as if through a layer of fog. "Of course, come up," I said, though my heart skipped uneasily. When the door to the roof opened, I saw her. Sarah looked as if she had been fighting against wind and rain, even though the weather outside was clear. She wore a wrinkled t-shirt and worn jeans. Her hair was tangled and her face was tired, almost exhausted. In her hands, she held a paper bag that smelled of something fried. "Sorry for just showing up like this," she said quietly, lowering her eyes. "I needed to just talk." I froze, still holding the towel with which I had just been wiping the glasses. The whole atmosphere of the evening changed in an instant. "Of course, come in," I said, moving the chair. She sat across from me as though she had just made a long journey and could finally rest. I silently removed the plate meant for Mark from her side and went to the kitchen for tea. When I returned, she was already looking at the sunset. Her eyes were empty, but in that empty gaze, there was something piercing. "Is everything okay?" I asked cautiously, pushing the cup toward her. "I don't know." She answered so quietly that I had to strain my hearing. We spoke little. Sarah dropped a few words about work, about how the last few days had been tough, but nothing specific. She avoided direct answers, as if afraid that the words spoken aloud would shatter her fragile balance. I didn't insist. Instead, I looked at the sunset, wondering when Mark would show up. Things were not going as planned, but I couldn't just tell Sarah that her presence was in the way. Her appearance was worrying, and I felt that she hadn't come for no reason. Sarah sat across from me, warming her hands on the cup of tea. Her fingers trembled slightly, even though it was warm outside. She looked at the tea as if hoping to find answers in its amber depths. We were silent. The whole situation felt like a scene from a movie. A dinner set for a romantic evening, candles, the soft glow of string lights, and a person who clearly wasn't in the right place at the right time. "Thank you for letting me in," Sarah finally said. Her voice was quiet, almost hoarse. "You look tired." I didn't know what else to say. "What happened?" She looked at me, and in her gaze there was something dark, heavy, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. "It's just, sometimes everything piles up," she finally said, wrapping her words in an evasive shell. "You know, when you're going, trying to be strong, but it feels like you're sinking?" I nodded. It was hard to understand exactly what she was trying to say, but I felt that her sinking ship had already gone down long ago, and only now was she deciding to ask for help. "You need to rest, Sarah. Take a break," I suggested cautiously. She smiled, but there was no joy in that smile. "Rest from what?" She laughed bitterly. "Life? It's not going anywhere." I didn't know what to reply. My thoughts kept jumping from her to Mark. He could show up at any moment. What would he think seeing her here? How could I explain why I was distracted by someone else's problems when we were supposed to spend the evening together? But Sarah seemed oblivious to my unease. She reached for her bag, pulled out a plastic container, and opened it. The smell of fried chicken mixed with the aroma of the candles, and the contrast was almost absurd. "Sorry," she said, noticing my expression. "I just haven't eaten all day." "It's fine," I lied. Sarah began eating slowly, as if this were her first proper meal in a week. She was here, sitting next to me, but her thoughts were clearly somewhere far away. I watched her tired face, the way she nervously tapped her spoon on the edge of the container, and thought, what happened to that carefree girl I used to run through the streets with? Why is she like this now? "You didn't just come here for no reason, did you?" I suddenly asked, feeling the tension inside me become unbearable. She looked up and surprise flickered across her face. She clearly hadn't expected that question. "I just couldn't be alone," she whispered. Those words sounded like a cry, but soft, muffled. There was a vulnerability in them that made me freeze. "You can always come to me," I said, even though I wasn't sure about my own words. She nodded but didn't answer. Her gaze fell once more on the sunset, which was beginning to turn dark purple. And in that moment, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Mark. The footsteps on the stairs grew closer. The door opened, and Mark entered with his usual smile and a small bouquet of daisies in his hands. He looked cheerful until he saw Sarah at the table. His smile faded. "Hey," he said, stopping at the entrance. "We have a guest." "This is Sarah." I hurried to explain. "She came unexpectedly. She needed to talk." "I see," he replied quietly, sitting down beside me. He placed the bouquet on the table, but his demeanor was no longer as light as usual. Sarah glanced at him and gave a faint smile. "Hi, Mark." "Hi." He responded politely, but with a hint of tension. A silence hung between us. Mark clearly felt out of place, but said nothing unnecessary. I caught his gaze, trying to explain without words that this wasn't my choice, but he only gave a barely noticeable nod. "I should probably go," Sarah suddenly said, standing up. "Thanks for the tea." I tried to stop her, but she had already grabbed her bag and was heading for the door. Mark watched her leave, silently holding the door open for her. When we were alone, he sat back down at the table and, looking at me, asked, "What was that?" "I don't fully understand it myself," I replied. Mark simply nodded and began eating, but his silence spoke louder than any words. Sarah stopped at the door to the roof and turned around, her gaze calm but tired. "Thank you for listening," she said quietly and sincerely. "I really needed this." "Are you sure you don't want to stay?" I asked, still feeling that her departure was too hasty. "No, I'll go. You've already done so much for me." Her smile was barely noticeable, almost apologetic. I stood up and offered her something to take with her. Pies, dessert, anything. But she gently shook her head. "No need. It's okay," she said, and after thanking me once again, she opened the door. Mark was standing nearby, silently watching her movements. When she had gone downstairs, he closed the door and turned to me. "What happened?" he asked. There was no judgment in his voice, just a desire to understand. "I don't know myself," I admitted honestly. She looked like she just needed to go somewhere, just not be alone. Mark nodded again, but his gaze was thoughtful, almost wary. We sat at the table, and I realized that the dinner I had prepared with such care had lost its lightness. Everything felt too strained, as if the air around us was filled with something unclear, but heavy. Mark ate his meal silently, and I could feel that he was mulling something over. We spoke about work, about weekend plans, but the words felt empty. The whole time I kept thinking about how quickly and unexpectedly Sarah had left, as if she didn't want to leave any trace behind. We sat at the table, and the silence between us seemed louder than the sounds of the city coming from the street. Mark ate in silence, staring at his plate as if there was something unusual on it. I tried to keep the conversation going, but each word seemed to hang in the air, failing to find a response. "How was your day at work?" I asked, forcing myself. "Fine," he answered shortly, not even lifting his eyes. I felt irritation rising inside me. He had always been so easy to talk to, but now he seemed distant. His silence was beginning to unsettle me. "You're angry, aren't you?" I couldn't hold it in. He finally looked up, met my gaze, and sighed. "No, I'm not angry. I'm just trying to understand." "Understand what?" He placed his fork on the table and folded his hands in front of him. "Why, when you plan something important, do you let others interfere?" "It's not like that," I retorted, feeling hurt. "Sarah she needed support. I couldn't just send her away, Mark." He shrugged, but his eyes told me that he didn't fully agree. "I'm not against you helping her," he said. "But it seems to me that sometimes you put yourself in uncomfortable situations for people who don't even think about how it will affect you." I wanted to respond, but suddenly froze. His words stung, but I couldn't deny that there was some truth in them. How many times had I really put my plans aside for someone else? But right now, I couldn't just justify myself. At this moment, I didn't fully know who was right. "Maybe you're right," I finally said quietly, but I couldn't do it any other way. He nodded, picked up his glass of wine, and took a sip. "I just want you to remember, we also have time that's important for the two of us," he added, and his voice held not judgment, but simply fatigue. The conversation faded. We finished eating in silence, and I felt how a thin, invisible wall had formed between us. Everything I had wanted for that evening was to create a special moment for us, but now it seemed shattered. The morning began unexpectedly. In my mailbox, I found a small note from Sarah. Her handwriting was a bit uneven, as if she had written in a hurry. "Sorry for yesterday. Can we meet? I need to explain. Sarah." I stared at the paper for a long time, feeling a swirl of conflicting emotions inside. The evening before had left a strange aftertaste, both from Sarah and from our conversation with Mark. But I decided that I should listen to her. We met at a small cafe on the corner, the one that always smelled of fresh pastries. Sarah was already sitting at a window table, holding a cup of tea in her hands. When I approached, she looked up at me with a faint smile that carried a hint of exhaustion. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly when I sat down across from her. "Of course. What happened?" I asked directly, trying not to waste time. She was silent for a few seconds, as if gathering her thoughts. "I'm sorry for yesterday. I know I shouldn't have just shown up like that, unannounced," she began. "I just didn't know where else to go." I listened, trying to understand her mood. Sarah looked better than the day before, but she still seemed somewhat lost. "Everything at work went wrong," she continued. "The project I had been working on for 6 months got shut down. I feel useless, like everything I do doesn't matter." She fell silent, and I saw her fingers gripping the cup tightly until her nails turned white. I knew that Sarah had always tried to seem strong, but now she was different. Honest, vulnerable. And all of this just piled up, you know? She looked up at me. I tried to handle it, but sometimes I feel like I can't anymore. "You can talk to me, Sarah," I said, feeling her words resonate deeply within me. "But why didn't you tell me this yesterday?" She smiled sadly. "I didn't want to burden you. You looked so happy, and I just barged in and ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything," I said, though the words were hard to say. I still remembered how the evening had unraveled, but I couldn't let her leave with that feeling. Sarah nodded, but I could see on her face that she didn't fully believe my words. We talked a little more, mostly about how she wanted to take a break to figure herself out. Her voice sounded more confident when she mentioned that. But even after our conversation, I felt like there was something she hadn't said, as if behind her words there was more than just fatigue from work. When I got home, her phrases were spinning in my head. I couldn't understand why the conversation left me with a weight. It seemed like there was some hidden meaning behind the lines of her words, something I hadn't figured out yet. In the evening, after my meeting with Sarah, I told Mark everything. We were sitting on the couch, and I tried to be as honest as possible, describing how Sarah felt lost and how important it was for her to talk things through. But his reaction was completely different from what I had expected. "You know, this is starting to get weird," he said, setting his phone aside. His voice was calm, but there was a tense note in it. "She shows up out of nowhere, dumps her problems on you, and leaves, and you're left to deal with it." "You're exaggerating," I replied. "She's just going through a tough time." "Everyone has moments like that." "Yeah, everyone has those moments," he said, standing up and crossing his arms. "But why is it always you? Why do you have to be the one who fixes her problems? Sarah always does this. She barges into your life and turns everything upside down. Don't you see that?" "She's my friend," I answered, already feeling the sting of frustration rising inside me. "Is it so bad to be there for someone when they're struggling?" "It's not bad," he sighed. "But the bad part is that she's just using you. You care so much about her, but has she ever once asked how you are? How you're coping?" "That's not fair, Mark," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's really on the edge right now. She just needs to be with someone." "What about you?" He turned sharply toward me, and there were more emotions in his eyes than I was used to seeing. "Do you need this stress? You looked upset last night. You know why? Because Sarah barged into our evening and you once again put her above us." Those words hit hard. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. His words had touched on something I was afraid to admit. I did often put other people's problems ahead of my own. But was that really a bad thing? Isn't that what friends do? "You don't understand," I said, struggling to hold back my emotions. "You're judging her without knowing what she's going through. And you don't understand that sometimes it's important to say no." He interrupted. "You can't save everyone." Those words were the last straw. I stood up and went to the kitchen to avoid looking at his disappointed gaze. My heart was pounding, and everything in my mind felt jumbled. Why couldn't he understand that I just wanted to help? A few minutes later, he came to me. His voice was softer now, almost conciliatory. "I don't want to fight," he said. "Just think about what I said. I'm worried about you." But I didn't answer. When he went to the bedroom, I stayed in the kitchen, alone. Looking out the window, I thought about Sarah, about Mark, and about myself. Why did this conversation leave me with such a strange feeling? It seemed like Mark was right. But then why did it hurt so much to admit it? At night, when everything in the house had quieted down, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. After the argument with Mark, I felt empty, as if all my emotions had been drained in just one evening. Sleep wouldn't come. The phone vibrated on the nightstand. I reached for it, thinking that maybe Mark had written something to make amends. But the screen showed a message from Sarah. "Thank you for meeting today. You've always been the one who knows how to listen. I'm planning to leave the city for a while. I need to be alone to figure things out. Everything will be fine. Thank you again." I read the message several times. It seemed like ordinary words of gratitude, but for some reason there was a strange finality in them, as if Sarah was closing a chapter on something bigger than just our meeting or a brief conversation. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to make sense of what exactly made me feel this strange heaviness. Was it her decision to leave? Or that she was embarking on this journey alone? There was no request for help in her words, just a statement. She had decided to leave, and all I could do was accept it. I wanted to write something in response, to ask where she was going, how long she would be gone, but my fingers hovered over the screen, frozen. All I could manage was a short reply. "You can always count on me. Take care of yourself." The message was sent, but it didn't bring any sense of relief. I put the phone down and turned back to the ceiling. My thoughts were loud, almost unbearable. Something wouldn't let go. Maybe it was guilt, or was it worry? But whatever it was, I knew this departure of hers would leave a mark. The question was, what kind of mark? In the morning, Mark acted as if nothing had happened. He suggested we take a walk to the store to buy ingredients for dinner and began talking about small things. How the weather would warm up even more soon, the new movie we could watch. It all sounded almost sincere, but I could tell he was just trying to brush off the events of the previous evening and move on. I agreed to the walk. We strolled down the street, buying vegetables, bread, picking out cheese, and everything felt normal. But inside me, there was still a lingering feeling. His words about how I put others above us still echoed in my head. I thought we could cook something together, he said, returning to his usual lightness. Okay, let's give it a try, I replied. When we got home, we started cooking. He chopped the vegetables and I prepared the dough for the pie. Mark was himself again, joking, teasing me for taking too long to roll out the dough. We even laughed when I accidentally oversalted the soup, just like I had so many times before. But somewhere deep inside, I understood that this wasn't the real world. It was more of his attempt to pretend that nothing had happened. And I played along, afraid to ruin the rare moment of calm between us. When dinner was ready, we sat down at the table as if everything were perfect. Mark lifted his gaze from his plate and said, "Let's just leave it behind. Sometimes arguments happen, but they're not that important." I nodded, unsure of what to say. His tone was soft, even conciliatory, but I felt like something was missing. Honesty? Depth? I didn't even know. I smiled and said, "Thanks for trying." He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "Everything will be fine," he said confidently. But I knew that inside, there was still a gap between that evening and this moment. A gap that we were both afraid to talk about. A week passed quietly, but the echoes of the recent events still reverberated inside me. I tried to return to my routine, focus on work, spend more time with Mark. He seemed to be trying to. Caring, joking, suggesting walks together. But I still felt that something unsaid remained between us. One evening, when I was about to brew some tea and do something simple, there was a soft, hesitant knock at the door. I opened it, and there stood Sarah. She looked better than before. Her face wasn't as tired, her hair was neatly tied up, and her eyes no longer held the emptiness I had seen on the roof. "Hi," she said with a slight smile. "Can I come in?" "Of course." I stepped aside, letting her into the apartment. We sat at the kitchen table. I put the kettle on and placed a plate of cookies in front of her, but she barely touched her cup. Her gaze was directed somewhere into space, as if she was gathering her thoughts. "I decided to stay," she suddenly said. "Stay?" I asked, surprised. "Yes. I realized that leaving would be running away, and I need to learn to cope here, in real life." She smiled faintly, as if not fully believing her own words. "That's brave, Sarah. I'm happy for you," I said sincerely. She nodded, thanking me with her eyes, and then unexpectedly changed the topic. "You know, that evening on the roof?" She started and hesitated. I tensed up, not expecting this shift. "What?" I felt like an outsider. She said directly but gently, "I barged into your evening that you had planned so carefully. I saw how hard you tried, how important it was to you. But I still came." Her words stung. I didn't know how to respond. "I'm sorry for that. I just wasn't thinking then," she continued. "I needed to go somewhere, to someone. And you've always been the one who accepts and supports." I looked at her, remembering that evening, her face at the table, her words. She was right. That night she had truly intruded into my world, not thinking about how it would affect me. "You didn't destroy anything," I finally replied. "It's just that sometimes I need space too." She nodded. There was genuine understanding in her eyes. We talked for a long time after that, recalling our childhood, the moments that had bound us so tightly. At some point, I felt that this was an important conversation that needed to happen. Not for her, for both of us. When Sarah left, I stayed alone in the kitchen. On the table lay a photo album with our old pictures. one I had pulled out before she arrived. I opened it and began flipping through the pages. Smiles from the past stared back at me, and I thought about how much our lives had changed. When Mark returned, he noticed that I was sitting with the album. In his hands was a bouquet, daisies as always. He placed them on the table and sat down beside me. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I answered, looking at him. "Just thinking about how the past still sometimes affects us." He took my hand but didn't say anything. In that moment, it seemed like a quiet honesty had returned between us, something that had been missing for a while. The night was quiet. I sat on the couch with a mug of hot tea, staring at the album that I hadn't closed. Mark dozed beside me, his head slightly tilted to the side, his breathing steady. The daisies in the vase on the table had started to wilt slightly, their white petals drooping. This evening was filled with a strange yet gentle silence. I thought about Sarah, about her words, about the conversation that left a deep mark. Her confession that she felt like an outsider unexpectedly clarified a lot. Not only about her, but about me too. Maybe I was also an outsider to her, without even realizing it. Maybe I had always been just someone who listens and supports, forgetting about my own boundaries. I flipped through the pages of the album until I found one of our photos. Sarah and I, still children, sitting on a wooden bench in an old park. We were wearing silly sun hats, our faces smeared with chocolate, both of us laughing. That carefree joy hadn't been present in either of our lives for a long time. Mark suddenly opened his eyes, lifted his head, and looked at me. "Why aren't you sleeping?" he asked sleepily, stretching. "Just thinking," I replied, closing the album and setting it on the table. He looked at me thoughtfully, as if trying to guess my thoughts. "You look lighter," he said, sitting up straight. "Lighter?" "Yes, like you've let something go." He smiled his warm, familiar smile that always calmed me. I thought about his words. Maybe it was true. The conversation with Sarah had closed some long-healing wound, reminded me that I couldn't always be someone else's safe haven without thinking about myself. "You're right," I said, placing my hand on his. "I guess I really have let go." He gently squeezed my fingers. We sat in silence, but it wasn't heavy anymore, like it had been before. It felt light, like the summer breeze that had passed across the roof that evening when everything started. I remembered those candles that had been burning, and I realized that evening wasn't a failure, but a step toward something new. It had shown me that honesty mattered more than anything. With Sarah, with Mark, and with myself. When I went to the bedroom, Mark stayed in the kitchen for a bit. A few minutes later, he came in with a bouquet of daisies. He had thrown out the old ones and placed these in a new vase. "I know you love them," he said simply. And in that moment, I understood. Everything I had been searching for was here. Not perfect evenings, not attempts to save others, but honest, sincere relationships where there was no need for pretense. We lay down to sleep, and I felt his hand holding mine under the blanket. A sense of peace washed over me. Tomorrow would bring a new day, but one without those gaps between the past and the present. Everything began to settle, slowly but surely. And that was enough. In the morning, I woke up before Mark. The room was quiet, and only the light of the winter sun filtered through the thin curtains. I lay still, listening to his steady breathing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to clarity inside. I got up to make coffee, and as I walked past the table, I glanced at the album that had been left out from the night before. So many memories were locked within its pages: joy, pain, laughter. But now I saw it differently. The photos no longer reminded me of what I had lost. They simply existed. Proof that the past has a place in our lives, but it shouldn't hold us back. Sarah no longer seemed like something unresolved. Last night had shown that her return was not accidental. It was a lesson I had needed to learn long ago. I can help others, but I shouldn't forget about myself. Her words, that she had felt like an outsider, stayed with me. But now they were not a grievance, but a reminder. We all feel like strangers to each other at times, and that's okay. The important thing is to learn to accept it and move forward. Mark came into the kitchen in his usual home t-shirt, stretching and yawning. His hair was sticking up in all directions, and he looked so peaceful that I couldn't help but laugh. "What's so funny?" he asked, pouring himself some coffee. "Nothing," I answered with a smile. "Just glad you're here." He stopped, looked at me more closely. "Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked, as though checking. "Yes, Mark, really. Everything's fine." And in that moment, I realized that these weren't just words. Whatever was happening around us, with Sarah, with the past, with us, I finally felt like I was standing on solid ground. Mark sat down at the table across from me, took my hand in his, and said, "You're different today." "Maybe," I nodded. "Or maybe I've just finally become myself." We sat there for a few minutes, enjoying our morning coffee and the silence. And in that silence, I felt something new. Peace, serenity, and a readiness for the future. Life went on, and I was ready to meet it, just as it was.